Welcome back to the Black Line Blueprint. In this episode, we are going to go into my exact blueprint on how to build strong, capable shoulders for sport and everyday life. So, this isn't about building the perfect shoulder per se. It's more so about building strength, mobility, control, and the capacity in your shoulder to stand up to the demands of whatever you're trying to place on it, whether it be in some type of sporting event or just a physical activity that you enjoy performing periodically throughout your week. So, the blueprint is broken down into 7 strategies, and let's get right into the first one. So, the first one is build rotator cuff strength. So, why this is so important is because the rotator cuff plays an important role in not only producing rotational forces, but also stabilizing that shoulder joint when you are performing your pressing, your pulling movements, your throwing movements, your any type of overhead movement, stabilizing barbells or anything like that overhead. Your rotator cuff plays a huge role in that. So we want to make sure that we are building up a strong enough, stable enough rotator cuff to be able to take on the demands of all of the things that we're going to put it through when it comes to shoulder performance. So, one of the ways that we do this is by adding direct rotator cuff strength either 2 to 3 days per week, depending on what you're participating in and what your training schedule look like. Most people, it will be probably 2 days a week that you'll incorporate the rotator cuff strengthening stuff. Because if you're doing a upper body, lower body split, more than likely you're doing 2 upper body days during the week. So that would end up being 2 days of the week you're doing rotator cuff training. Or if you're doing a full body workout split, then the priority would be to at least get 2 of those training sessions in to build up that rotator cuff a little bit more or focus in on that. If that is, again, the weakness there that you're struggling with. So, how do we do this? What would that actually look like as far as exercises? So, one of the things I like to do is side lying external rotations. This exercise has been shown to have the biggest effect on the external rotators of the rotator cuff, which tend to be in most people, let's just say most people in general, underdeveloped or just a little bit weaker. So we want to make sure that we are building up that rotator cuff. Plus, it takes on a lot of demands whenever we are performing pushing, punching, pitching, any type of throwing motion. It has to decelerate that shoulder joint. So if that is not as strong as it should be, then we are stressing out that shoulder a lot more, and we put that rotator cuff at risk of injury if it can't keep up with the demands of that specific sport. Okay, so anyway, back to the exercises. So sideline external rotations is another one I like. You can do cable or banded external rotations at 90 degrees. So you're bringing your elbow up to about shoulder height, and then you're doing your external rotations at that particular height. Because if you are performing some type of movement that requires, let's just say, overhead external rotation stability, then now you're training that external rotation in that more specific position. So we're not getting crazy with sport specific performance, but we are translating that into getting the shoulder strong in all the positions that we could possibly get it strong in order to take on the demands of the things that we'll be doing. Scaption raises is another great exercise. I've had plenty of patients come into the clinic with rotator cuff type of injuries or impingement syndromes, and scaption raises tend to be one of the exercises that do not produce or irritate their already irritated shoulder. So obviously, scaption raises, if you think about a front raise, a dumbbell front raise or a dumbbell lateral raise, think about going right in between those two extremes. So you're going at about raising your arm at about a 45-degree angle, and you have your fist or your thumb pointed up towards the sky. So instead of your palm down, your palm is going to be facing inward. And then from there, you just raise that arm up to about shoulder height. So that would be your scaption raise. So instead of thinking about a front raise or a lateral raise, think about a scaption raise when you're thinking about your accessory work to improve your rotator cuff strength. Now, front raises, lateral raises, they do help improve the rotator cuff strength as well. But if we are specifically trying to engage the rotator cuff muscles more, scaption raises tend to do it. Okay. So controlled internal rotation exercises as well. This one, not so much high on the priority list just because internal rotation isn't necessarily something that's weaker on the list. But depending on your weaknesses and what you notice, you may need some internal rotation work. So that's directly targeting the rotator cuff with specific accessory exercises. Um, and you would progress this just like anything else. But with this one, you think more lighter weights that you would use. You would probably stick within that maybe 8 to even 15 rep range for those movements. And you might do anywhere from one set if you're doing it as a prep, as your warm up, or you might do it for 2 to 3 sets if you're doing it as accessory exercises towards the end of your workout. Um, so the other thing when it comes to rotator cuff strength is that you can train it indirectly with compound movements. So once again, your rotator cuff helps stabilize your humerus, so that upper arm bone in the joint while you're performing these movements. So to make the movements more efficient and to allow you to express the most power and strength. So if you are pressing and pulling, you are targeting that rotator cuff. But again, if they're underdeveloped, sometimes the other muscles take over a lot more in those movements. So, what movements would have the most effect on the rotator cuff? Dumbbell exercises, because you have a more stability component that's involved in that compared to a barbell, right? With your arms fixed in place. So, maybe in your training, you can swap out more barbell movements for, let's just say, a period and use more dumbbells. Also, carries. So, if it's dumbbell carries, overhead carries, with the dumbbell or kettlebell, landmine presses, rows, push-ups, more of a kind of a closed chain movement, but your rotator cuff activates a lot more in those kind of closed chain movements there. And other upper body exercises require the shoulder musculature to control the joint while producing force too. So, um, yeah, so with those compound movements, you just want to think about what's going to require more stability from my shoulder in those particular movements. All right, the next point here that we're going to get into is point number 2, which is prioritize compound pressing and pulling exercises. So why? So if you're overall training for strength and performance of your shoulder, isolation exercises making up the majority of your training is not going to do the job. So isolation exercises such as bicep curls or dumbbell lateral raises or front raises or flies, those movements aren't going to do it. You have to prioritize the compound movements because you want everything to learn how to work together more efficiently. So, in more of those compound movements, and obviously if we're thinking of strength, the more musculature that's involved, the more load that you can lift. So if we're doing a compound pressing motion instead of doing just a fly, if doing a bench press, you're going to lift way more load than doing a fly. Or even doing a dumbbell bench press, you're going to use way more load than doing a dumbbell fly. So that concept is pretty easy to understand. So if we're looking to improve our shoulder strength and performance, and I won't harp on this anymore, we need to prioritize the compound movements. So what I do in my programs is I build it around a few movements. It's a horizontal press or horizontal pull, a vertical press or a vertical pull, or even going at an angle. But think about vertical, you can do it at an angle, you can do pulling at an angle as well. But anyway, horizontal, vertical, pushing and pulling exercises. You don't have to have all of them in one workout, but you want to hit all of those within a week. And you also have to think about the mobility you actually have access to as well. Because if you don't really have good overhead mobility, then vertical pressing and pulling may be something that you want to just reduce in your training or even eliminate and modify in your training for now until you improve your overhead mobility. So that way you're not exposing yourself to stressing out other tissues and potential overuse injuries because you don't have the range of motion that you're trying to force your shoulder joint into. So what this could look like is, let's just say your one day of training for your upper body, a horizontal press would be, let's just say your dumbbell bench press or a push-up. Your horizontal pull would be your dumbbell row, or let's just say a inverted row or a ring row. So that's your horizontal press and pull. Boom. That's what you have for that day. The next training day, maybe you have your vertical press and your vertical pull. So that could be your dumbbell press, and it could be your pull up, or it could be your single arm cable pull down. Those are examples of combining the two angles that you're going to be pulling from or pushing from. So you want to think about doing it with that combination. It makes it pretty simple, right? So if you're horizontally pressing, you're horizontally pulling, that makes it easy to think about the exercises you'll do on that day. If you're vertical pressing, you're vertical pulling, makes it easy to think about the exercises you'll do on that day. Now, again, if you don't have the range of motion, you may be doing horizontal pressing and pulling on both of those days. It all depends on what you have access to as far as your range of motion. Okay. All right. So let's get into the next point. So, point number 3, use strategic exercise variation. So, variation exposes your shoulder to different positions, ranges of motion, loading patterns, and stability demands. Okay. So, this can help you gain a broader physical capacity to perform whatever movements the shoulder has to go through when it comes to the sporting demands or the activity demands that you're going to put it through. All right. But you have to have a purpose with your variation. If you don't have a purpose with your variation, then you may lose the benefit of variation, which is broad capability. And then you may not be able to build as much strength, as much power, as much stability and control in that shoulder as you would like. Okay. So, how do we do this? You keep your primary exercises relatively consistent, right? So, if we're going to do the bench press, for our primary horizontal pressing exercise, then we keep that exercise in there for 4 weeks, maybe 8 weeks, or maybe even 12 weeks in our program. And we just change up the rep scheme that we're going to use for it. But in our accessory exercises, now we choose variation. Okay. So if our bench press, our shoulders are kind of tacked down and we don't really get good scapular movement during that motion, now we might want to have one of our accessory exercises be a push-up. So then we could get some more scapular movement and proper shoulder mechanics when it comes to that. The other thing we can think about doing would be some type of landmine press. So now we're going at a different joint angle. We're getting different motions from the scapula that requires the scapula to go through a different position than it would with the bench press. Okay, and that rotator cuff to work a little bit more as well. Using cables, using dumbbells. So many different options when it comes to that. Another thing is expose the shoulder to, like I was just mentioning, that closed chain or open chain movement patterns, because whatever you're going to be doing and your shoulder requires from you. So let's just think of rock climbing, for instance. If I do a ton of bench pressing or if I do a ton of barbell rows, that may not be the best exercise to translate over or as specific to translate over into rock climbing. So what might be more of a translation over would be maybe inverted rows. So I'm pulling my body towards my arms, just like I'll be pulling my body towards my arm when it comes to rock climbing as well. So you want to think about specifically what you're trying to translate over to. You don't have to overdo it. Again, we want that variety, that variation, but you want to include it in your training. So you're building capacity to hopefully allow that to translate into the activity that you're performing and allow you to perform that activity a lot more without breakdown and fatigue. Okay. All right, so getting into point number 4, develop scapular strength and control. So your scapula is the base for which your arm motions are primarily going to be founded on. So your foundation, okay? So if obviously in everything, if you don't have a strong foundation, then your movements aren't going to be as efficient as they should be. And you're not going to be able to develop enough strength and enough power or be able to express those qualities as you would if you did have more of a strong, stable base. So the scapula rotates whenever you're doing upward motion of your arm. So elevating that arm overhead when you're pressing, when you're pulling, the scapula has to go through a few different variations of movement patterns in order to accomplish that motion from that shoulder joint. So if the scapular isn't strong enough or has enough control, then that movement isn't going to be efficient like it should be. Now, you don't have to have, let's just say, a perfect scapular positioning, but you do want your scapula to be strong and you want it to actually be able to control that motion that you're trying to perform. So, for instance, overhead movements, if we're trying to control a barbell overhead, if we're doing a snatch or an overhead squat, then we need the scapula to be able to elevate or upwardly rotate properly. And if it's not upwardly rotating properly, then we're going to have an insufficient base of support for that movement, which is going to limit the amount of weight that we can put overhead. And then it can cause movement compensations, which can stress out other muscles and just fatigue us a lot faster in that movement. Okay, so now how do we train this? So you want to think about the primary muscles that control the scapula. So one of those are the serratus anterior muscle. So it's a muscle that's kind of like on the posterior aspect. So on the on the flat side, the side that you can't see of your scapula, okay? The one that's against your rib cage. So you can think about movements that you're doing like a push-up plus. So you're doing a push-up, but then you're also pushing yourself away from the floor at the top of the motion. So it's almost like you're sticking your back out. So rounding that back a little bit more. Serratus punches. So you're on flat on your back, kind of like doing a bench press. So a dumbbell bench press, but instead of just stopping when your arm reaches that endpoint, you press a little bit further, throwing that shoulder blade forward, kind of like you're trying to put your deltoid, your front deltoid towards your chin. So you're punching forward like that. You have wall slides, you have bear crawls, and then overhead carries. All those things can help engage the serratus anterior a lot more, which is a very, very important muscle for upward rotation and proper control of overhead movements. Okay. And then the traps. So primarily I look at the lower traps because typically those muscles are ones that tend to not get enough work because of how much stronger or more of the movement patterns that we do, we emphasize the upper traps or the mid traps. So prone Ys. So laying on your stomach and raising your arms up and making a Y with your body. So think about looking down on your body and seeing a Y. So making a Y, performing that with dumbbells, very lightweight for these motions because it's just a very challenging motion to get right and engage the right muscles. Because when you're performing these movements, you can really screw it up by just trying to throw that your arm back and allowing that shoulder to just ride forward. You want to think about initiating the movement with pulling your shoulder blade back when you're doing this exercise. And you want to think about, you should feel it in your mid back. Okay. So incline, trap, 3 raises, rows as well, and then overhead carries also. You can also use slower tempos with these movements. So if you're, or even pauses in those movements. So if you're doing an overhead press, you can slowly press up overhead. Let's say a 3-second on the way up and then a 3-second pause at the top and a 3-second on the way down for a single arm dumbbell overhead press, or even if you're doing the barbell press. So remember the barbell press, right? Whether it's dumbbell or bench press, requires a little less stability from the shoulder than if you were using a dumbbell implement or a kettlebell implement. So maybe even just adding a tempo to that movement can help you engage those muscles a little bit more or allow them to do their job a little bit more effectively. But if we think about actually working the rotator cuff along with those other scapular muscles, we want to think about maybe using implements like the dumbbell and the kettlebell a little bit more. But eventually that control needs to hold up under heavier loads and faster movements. So you still have to expose it to heavier movement. So if we're thinking about a faster load overhead, then it would be something like a push press. So you can do dumbbell push press as well, right? You can do a barbell push press. You can do kettlebell push press. If it's an overhead squat, you can think about doing an overhead squat, or you can think about doing a snatch balance movement if you're trying to improve your performance for snatches or whatnot, and those type of overhead movements. So you can implement a slower tempo, and that can help you improve the coordination of the scapular muscles. Point number 5 is to build the mobility that your specific activity requires. So strength is specific to the position. So if you cannot acquire that position, so let's just say if the activity or sport that you're trying to perform requires you to have good overhead mobility and you can't get into that position because maybe you lack some thoracic extension, thoracic rotation, or shoulder flexion, whatever it may be, then you're not going to be able to express the strength in that position, just like we were talking about beforehand. So you need to improve your specific mobility for that specific activity. Okay. So first, determine what's actually limited. All right. So look at you got shoulder flexion that may be limited. So bringing that shoulder, that arm up overhead, think about overhead pressing, overhead pulling motions. Think about a tennis serve, or think about throwing a pitch overhead, those type of things. Or even if it's swimming, right? Or rock climbing, reaching up overhead that way. Shoulder external rotation. So again, if it's overhead motions, you're rotating your arm you're putting your arm into external rotation. Shoulder internal rotation, sometimes this is relevant, sometimes it's not, but some sports do require you, and activities do require you to have good shoulder internal rotation. Okay. So thoracic rotation. So, like I said before, so rotating your thoracic spine, so your upper back mobility, so your ability to rotate through that position, and then thoracic extension when required. Okay, so your ability to extend through your upper back. Um, then you got to address that limitation. So mobility drills can include, so some of my favorite, thoracic extension over a foam roller. So pretty much you lying on the foam roller and you having that foam roller over or under your mid to upper back, and then you just extending over it. This can also double down as a shoulder flexion exercise because you can just bring your arms up overhead and then you can just extend through it like that as well. And just go through repetitions of that specific movement. So it might be 10 to 15 extensions over the foam roller at the beginning of your workout just to try and access more of that range. Then, of course, you always have to strengthen in that new range. Thoracic rotations, you can do a side lying rotation. So we call it an open book exercise or just side lying thoracic rotations. Um, Wall slides. So wall slides not only help you build control, but it also helps you build some mobility as well. So you could also think about child's pose for shoulder flexion drills, and then loaded mobility exercises too. So if you're thinking about trying to improve your external rotation, you can think about let's just say lying on your back and then just having a little weight in your hand and just letting that arm go back into external rotation to improve that. Okay. So don't just stop with the passive mobility stuff. Also include strengthening through that new range. Because once you gain access to that position, you want to progressively load that position because that's going to allow you to maintain it because the body learns the position. It's also strengthening that muscle tissue in that lengthened range. So it learns it and it's able to keep it because the body likes to go into positions that it believes it can control. So if it doesn't believe it can control the position, it'll try to avoid that position so as to protect that joint tissue and that specific joint as well. So think about these things. So shoulder flexion mobility, strengthening will look like maybe overhead presses or carries, right? So we're strengthening in that range. We're building control in that new range, right? So if we did, let's just say some child poses, maybe we did some thoracic extensions over the foam roller, and now we go into maybe double overhead kettlebell carries, or maybe we go into double dumbbell overhead carries, whatever it may be. Thoracic rotation, so rotational cable rows. So you're rotating your upper back while pulling and rowing that specific movement. Medicine ball work. So if you're tossing the medicine ball with one arm, or if you're just doing rotations. So those are just a few examples there. All right. So the goal isn't just necessarily to access the position, it's to be able to control the position. So always remember that passive mobility is good, but strength and control at the end range is much better. All right. Number 6. So build lower body strength and power. So shoulder performance doesn't always start at the shoulder, right? So if we're throwing, if we're punching, if we're throwing a medicine ball, all those things require force to be generated from the ground up. Okay. So if we're looking at improving our strength and performance in our shoulder, also generating good amount of power through there, we need to think about the movements that we're going to be performing. And if we do not have good lower body strength and power, then we're not going to be able to express those qualities as well as we would like. So how do we do this? So you build a general lower body strengthening program with these specific movements, or you can think about these movement patterns. Think about a squat pattern, a lunge pattern, some type of bending pattern, and then also your direct core work. But you think about dumbbell squats, back squats, front squats, obviously any of the squat variations, but also remember your lunge pattern. So think about lunges, reverse lunges, rear footed elevated split squats, deadlifts. So think about RDLs, Romanian deadlifts with the barbell, dumbbell RDLs. Think about a good morning step ups. Those are all good lower body movements that you can do and that you can load up pretty heavily with those movements. So for general strength development, you want to think more so on the lines of staying somewhere around the 5 to 12 rep range, depending on the exercise and the training phase and the goal that you have set for yourself. Okay. So that just allows you to build a good amount of strength, a good amount of size if needed, if required. But also not overdo it with strength work or go into some lower repetition work and heavy loads that you may not be prepared for. Then you got to develop the ability to produce force quickly. So now that you built the strength, you got to use other movements that's going to express that strength quickly. So what is that? Box jumps. Think about broad jumps, single leg box jumps, trap bar jumps. So you're having a little bit of load now. Squat jumps and medicine ball throws or rotational medicine ball throws, right? So you do the strength training that develops your ability to generate a good amount of force, but then you also have to generate that force quickly whenever you want to try and develop some power as well. Okay. So if the goal is to express some power, some good amount of power, you need to do a combination of both of those things. All right. So finally, point number 7, practice your sport. This is so important, but so many people often forget it. They overemphasize maybe some of the things in the gym. They try to get crazy specific with sport performance training in the gym, and they literally forget it, that you have to be efficient at performing your sport or the activity that you're trying to improve your shoulder performance in. So strength develops those physical qualities, but the sport practice teaches you how to apply those qualities. And you also develop the skill so that way you can move more efficient, and also that expression now of the strength that you gain, the power that you gain can show up. So getting stronger doesn't automatically make you better at throwing, punching, swimming, serving, climbing, or even grappling. But those skills require good timing, good coordination, positioning, and technique for that specific activity. And if you don't participate in that activity enough, then those things will be off and you can't express what you want to express in those things. So, an example would be like if you were participating in jujitsu, you can have crazy strong shoulders, chest, triceps, biceps, back in the gym and doing all those exercises. But that strength doesn't teach you how to frame properly, how to post up on your hands, how to create some good leverage or position your body against another person. Only your technique is going to determine that. So you can't, and really, if you try to rely on your strength for that, and I've experienced it too, you end up fatiguing out your body a lot quicker. So you can gas out because you don't know how to properly and efficiently move when it comes to those things. So you want your strength to be a leverage and not necessarily a crutch, right? A strength is a leverage, not a crutch. So you don't want it to hold you back and inhibit your ability to, learn and develop the skills because you are just relying on your strength. All right. So the principle here is to build the capacity in the gym, build the skill in the sport. The two will work together. So putting it all together. So my shoulder strength and performance blueprint comes down to the 7 areas. You got to build rotator cuff strength, progressively overload compound pressing and pulling exercises, use strategic exercise variation, develop scapular strength and control, build mobility required for your activity, develop lower body strength and power when the activity requires whole body force production, and then also practice the actual sport or skill that you are trying to get good at. So the biggest point here is you want to just match the capacity of whatever sport or activity that you're trying to participate in. So again, your shoulder doesn't need to move perfectly, but it needs to have the capacity, the strength, the mobility, the coordination to participate and to be able to take on the demands of whatever you're trying to put it through. Your sport, your skill, your activity, whatever the demands you're placing on your shoulder, you want it to be able to handle those things. And that's what it all comes down to. So instead of thinking about what is the perfect exercise, shoulder exercise for strength or mobility or to reduce pain or injuries, you want to think about what does my shoulder need in order to perform my best at this specific activity or sport. So if you want help applying any of this to your training, you can book a free call with me by going to the link in the description or the show notes. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.